Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I am so excited that David Willows and Suzette Parlevliet are back with me here today. They are from Yellow Car. I think, Suzette and David, you were episode 7. If I don't, I have to go back and confirm, but I'm pretty sure you're episode 7. By the time we launched this, I think we're either in the late 80s and 90s in terms of episodes. So much has happened between our last conversation when we talked about the faculty experience. Today, we're going to talk about the family experience and why that's important. And I know here in the US, it's just an increasingly critical conversation to have. How do we provide amazing experiences, not only for our enrolled families, but also for our prospective families too? So we're going to dig into all of that in a little bit. But before we do that, David, Suzette, welcome to the podcast and happy 4th birthday to Yellow Car, because I know you just celebrated that.
Thank you,
Thank
Peter. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, so great. Hey, before we get going, if you can introduce yourselves and your work at Yellow Car, that would be terrific.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. It's great to be back, even though that we feel like we're veterans now on this.
You know,
podcast.
you're in a small club. Like, more people are coming back on the show, but it's just 4 or 5. So welcome to the club.
So we know when we get invited a third time, then we're really special. But
Like,
yeah, I think So many of you may know us. If you don't know us, I'm David. This is Suzette. We actually first met because we worked for many years together at the International School of Brussels in Belgium, where we were running the advancement department and responsible for many aspects of school life there. And then 4 years ago, we set up Yellow Car. And I think this was really part of our journey of working together, but also seeing the opportunity that there was to bring a new discourse into the independent and international school markets, to really think about what is the experience that we are intentionally designing for different stakeholders, for students, for parents, and for employees within schools. And so for the past 4 years, we've been really working with schools all over the world to actually help them design and measure that experience in their school. But I'm going to hand over to Suzette, who might tell us the secret of why Yellow Car, because you might already be intrigued if you don't know of why a company would be called Yellow Car.
Yeah, because it is a bit of a funny name, isn't it, when you work with schools around the world? And it's actually going back to this childhood game that both David and I used to play when we were younger. I grew up in the Netherlands, and every summer we would go to southern France, and it would be in European standards a long car journey. And I would be sitting on the back seat with my brother and sister. And to make that a bit more interesting, we would try to find a yellow car. Now, in and of itself, when we found that yellow car and we declared ourselves the winner, not very interesting. But what is remarkable is that once you start looking for that yellow car, you start seeing them everywhere. And we feel in a world where schools tend to look the same, it can be hard to stand out, to differentiate, and to be seen as truly different. And we feel that the schools that will stand out and are standing out are those that are intentionally designing that experience of school for their community members. So that's why yellow car.
And I love that on so many levels. And you also live it too, because if anybody follows you on LinkedIn, they'll know when they see a photo of you, you're both wearing your yellow shoes and they just stand out and really differentiate from everybody else in the crowd. So I think that's great. But let's talk about that differentiation and how that manifests itself in experience strategy. I know we talked about that last time with the faculty on the faculty side, and folks can go back into the pod and find that episode. But why is it equally important? Why is experience strategy so important for enrollment, retention, and culture right now?
I think one of the starting points we often say is it's worth thinking about what is the difference between a good and a great hotel. If you walk into a great hotel, one of the things that you notice is that everything has been designed with intention, and you feel it. You feel the way you can check in, the signage to your room, the everything about the wayfinding. All of those things have been designed with a degree of intentionality that makes you feel good and engaged and more willing to pass on the good message that this is a great hotel. And I think one of the things that we're saying in very crowded school markets these days is that experience strategy is really about bringing that same level of intentionality to the way in which school is designed. And I think one of the things that we are looking at in many of the schools in which we work is that there are so many good things that are happening, but they haven't necessarily been designed with that level of intentionality. And so they might have a great admissions department that is so welcoming and friendly. But if it's troublesome to find that parking space outside the school, then that's going to break down the experience and probably impact the family well before they ever get to the admissions office. And so what we're looking at with schools is how do you create an experience that at every stage of the journey is going to be one that is designed with that same degree of intentionality.
And that is important and is actually having a significant impact because the moment you create irresistible experiences, people want to be part of it. So the moment the school becomes more intentional about that experience, it doesn't just improve the actual experience, but the more positive that experience is, the more likely people are staying, the more likely they're will be talking about it, which is increasing your word of mouth and then ultimately also your enrollment. It I mean, I know we're talking here about the family experience, but equally when we're thinking about employees, they're also more likely, a school's more likely to retain and actually attract talent if they have a positive experience in the school. Also, if we're thinking about fundraising, it's more likely to build support. And this is where experience strategy is no longer a nice to have. It's actually essential to make sure that um, that flywheel of enrollment, that journey that families are on, is functioning well.
I I know schools are very mission focused, right? That's one of the things that make them so special. Whether that shows itself in the classroom, on the playing field, on the stage, all the different things, right? But what's interesting is when you think about, like, I think back on my school experience, I'm sure, like, if I talk to my daughter who's a freshman right now in college, she thinks back on hers. She remembers, like, specific moments in time, not necessarily what she was studying in pre-calculus per se. It was that experience with a teacher, it was experience with her friends, it was something that delighted her, and I can think back and I just talk to others, and it seems like folks have a similar perspective. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, we're very mission focused, but how do we balance that while designing for family, students, employees so that they get that feel, right? Like, that feel is consistent and prevalent across multiple areas and, like, I think, Suzette, you said it, it's like really intentional.
It's something we often think about. I'm gonna go back to the hotel for a minute and just be a little bit controversial. So I think it's actually really important that organizations are mission focused because that gives them direction, it gives them identity, it gives
Yeah.
them purpose. But I'm going to ask a question. When was the last time, not the first time, but when was the last time you walked into a great hotel and walked up to the reception desk and said, "What's your mission?"
Yeah,
Probably
seriously.
Probably never. And the reason for that is that as a hotel guest, what you're really interested in is how is my night going to be? Are you going to provide the facilities, the food, the bed, the spa, whatever it is that I need tonight? And yes, your mission might be interesting, but it's secondary to those primary needs. And I actually think that many people walking into our schools are only secondarily interested in our mission. They will feel it by the way we behave, but their primary need is, "I need a job to be done." And that job to be done is, "I want you to educate my child or my children, and I want them to have a certain kind of education, maybe for a certain kind of future, and I have that expectation in my mind, and I want that to be a process that goes in a certain kind of way." And I think that what this balancing act is, sometimes as schools, we can feel like there's so much to talk about in terms of our mission, the quality of our leadership, even our pedagogy, where in fact we fail to understand some of those basic needs that parents have, which is how is my child going to fit in? Will they make friends? Are they going to move on to the next stage of their education? Actually, will they learn anything along the way? And those kinds of basic questions are ones that we maybe fail to address sometimes. So I think that balancing act is understanding that the mission is driving the identity of the school and the feeling that people have. But actually, when we come to engage with families, the experience should be designed around what is the job that different families need to have done in that moment.
But doesn't the mission give you direction in terms of what those experiences should be and how they should, how they should play to whatever job, a family's hiring you to do? I just think about like my son, right? So he's a ninth grader here in Seattle and is at an independent school. And I honestly I can't recite the school's mission. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can feel it through the experiences that he's having for sure.
But
So I'm just curious, like, what are your reactions to that? Yeah.
but I think you're saying it right. You actually can't remember what the mission is. The reality is that most mission statements are either very similar and unmemorable. And if that mission statement is unmemorable, it doesn't really allow you to engage with that mission in any way. So I think what that mission can do, it's not just giving that direction, it can create a certain frame as to where the school is putting its focus. But ultimately, what you are feeling as a student, as a parent, as an employee in the school is actually the knock-on effect of that mission, of what that actually means in terms of the actual experience that that is creating within the school. Um, David was just talking about jobs to be done for families. Hertzberg in the 1960s, a social psychologist, famously came up with the dual factor theory, where he is saying if we're looking at what motivates us to purchase something, you can set it up into two different kind of categories. You have the satisfiers and the dissatisfiers. Now, what are those two? Dissatisfiers are the things that we assume, the things that we expect. They can never go up to a value of zero, beyond zero. So let's take that example of the hotel again that David was talking about earlier. If I am walking down the street and I'm looking at the different hotels that are out there, and there's a sign that says, "We have clean rooms." There's no hotel that will say that because I'm assuming that when I'm booking a hotel room, those rooms are clean. And if they don't have clean rooms, it will have a -10 or whatever. So those are the dissatisfiers, the things that we assume. And then you have the satisfiers. And those are the things that give that edge, that makes it special, that persuade us to go to a particular place. So again, in a hotel, we might be talking about a beautiful view or the spa facilities or something along those lines. Now, our schools are not any different. And we are often leading with our dissatisfiers. We are talking about the teacher quality, our academic program, where it has a safe and secure campus.
Great.
Those are the things that families expect. They assume that that's already part of the package. And it doesn't mean it's unimportant. We need to validate that. But to what extent are we actually talking about the satisfiers, the things that are actually setting us apart and that persuade families for choosing our particular school? And there we can think about that might be a thriving alumni community, additional programming, maybe a gorgeous campus. But that is more touching into, I think, what you were alluding to, the things that you remember being in the school when after you've left. So they are those soft moments, maybe a connection with a teacher. I think that's where that nuance is. And if we're thinking about how we're attracting families, it's less focusing on that mission talk and more focusing on, as David said, what's the job to be done and what are they actually looking for? What are those satisfiers?
Suzette, I couldn't agree more. Like like if you go onto an independent school website, and we did this for a long time for valid reasons. We continue to do it, but what are you typically seeing on the homepage? You're seeing student teacher ratios. You're seeing college acceptance lists. You're seeing stats and figures. But what you're saying is, what are those deeper moments, those deeper experiences that are really resonant with people? And I love that description. I'm totally holding on to that. I'm gonna, I was telling David and Suzette, before we started, like one of the benefits of the pod for me is like that's become kind of a mini master's degree for me because I get to talk to all these really smart people and just learn and learn and learn. And like this episode is just such a great example of that. Hey, I know you do this experience indicator data set, and you had talked about that last time on the pod. Um, Before I get to my deeper question here, can you just like lay that out and talk about what that is?
Yeah, so I think as we began to work with schools in different places, kind of led to the question all the time, like we can design everything we want, but how do we actually know what that experience is? How do we know how people are experiencing school? And we knew that we'd done in our work dozens of satisfaction surveys down the years, and most of that led to almost zero change and just lots of piles of quotations of people who might like or not like the work that we're doing. And I think um, as we thought about this and we had conversations with people early on in our journey, um, we came up with this idea of the felt experience indicator. In other words, it was a little bit like the net promoter score, but expanded. Because the net promoter score is good because it gives you a number in terms of how are people experiencing something to the extent that they will recommend it. And yet in a way what we found was that the net promoter score doesn't give any insight into why they might be recommending it or not. And so the felt experience indicator really is a tool that we developed that is, in a sense, much broader. It has more questions around it that now schools are using to actually measure the experience. There is a felt experience indicator that we have that we can benchmark against other schools, but it actually provides these qualitative, quantitative data points that enable us to track things like the wavelength of happiness through a school. We can see as you go through, as you look at students across the school, does happiness peak in certain grades or dip in certain grades? We can actually understand what are some of the things that people are feeling, let's say parents, in terms of the highs of their experience or the lows of their experience. And I think what schools are finding is that this tool is providing them with a mirror, a picture of how things are, but also linking very much into future strategic planning that they're doing, accreditation that they're doing, and also that general sense of, how can we improve and how can we build this culture of listening? So that's a short story for a big part of the work that we're doing now, but that's the felt experience indicator.
And so I'm guessing that you've got quite the data set. Like, what are some of the patterns that you're seeing, and what are some of the things that really jump out at you in terms of, hey, schools, you should be thinking about doing these things differently?
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about what some of the stories are underneath the data. And now with schools doing it for the third year in a row, and more schools participating, we begin to see some real stories appearing. We call them almost story arcs. Um, I would say there's three clear ones that keep on coming back in most schools. So the first one is what we call the end of the honeymoon, and that means that if we are looking at what we call a wavelength, you can imagine it as a line graph. Based on the number of years that someone has been at the school, what we're seeing is that after the first year, that dips significantly for a number of years before that's rising again. And it doesn't matter whether we are asking students, parents, employees, event attendees, even heads of school, they all follow that similar pattern. And what's interesting is if we break it down, for example, if we look at that same wavelength broken down by students, parents, and employees, we can see maybe that they're experience diverse. So, in other words, certain uh, groups have rate their experience more positively than others, but that pattern of a downward trend the first few years before it lifts again is the same across the board. Um, Another pattern that we're noticing is something that we call the messy middle. This is more linked to the student experience. So here we're looking at students from grade 5 to grade 12. And again, if we're thinking about that line graph with dips and peaks, what we're seeing is stronger fluctuations within the middle school years. And it's not necessarily in the same exact grade levels in every single school, but what that particular pattern, the question that that's raising for us is, is that really linked to the experience of school, or is that telling us more about what it's like to be a teenager? And this is where Dave was just mentioning qualitative data. It's interesting for the school to dive deeper into that to see, for example, if there's a dip in grade 7, what might be contributing to that dip? Is it indeed something more context specific, linked to the cohort itself, or is it actually something that's happening within the actual experience of school? And then there's a last pattern that we're noticing. This is mostly linked to the parent experience when we're looking at the wavelength from, say, preschool to grade 12. What we are seeing is what we call life at the business end. So it's the atrophy of the experience, where that experience is diminishing over time. And that doesn't necessarily mean over length of time. In this case, we're also looking at the different grade levels. And we're wondering whether that's more linked to the anxiety levels that parents might have, where in the early years, they are looking for curiosity and play and inquiry. And as their children grow up, the stakes go up, exams begin, and they get to that end of the learning journey. That's very likely where that anxiety might be rising a bit more and that experience is diminishing. So those are some of the patterns that we're noticing in our quantitative data points.
Like, that's really fascinating. And I know one of the things that you've noticed as well is that parent communication overload and staff workload came up as universal friction points. So if you were sitting with a school right now, you had 10 or 15 minutes with them, maybe you're at a conference and you're just kind of, having a conversation and they were asking you about this, what are the first 3 moves that they could make to reduce both at the same time? And ultimately, who should own that work?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think what we are seeing is that communications is a universal friction point. There's also almost no school that we're walking into where parents aren't saying, we just feel overwhelmed.
Yeah.
There's just information coming to us from all sorts of angles, etc. And a lot of that, when we dig into it, is about this idea of intentional design, that there's a lot of communication going on, but it's not being communicated with intentionality. So it's coming from everywhere. It's all good, well intended, but in one sense, it just feels as though it's a little bit of an overload to families. So I think one of the first moves might be to understand what the communication is. And what we found is that when we've talked to parents, we suddenly discover that, like a parent that we spoke to a little while ago, she was saying, I have 4 kids in the school. I have 36 emails a day from the school. And all of the information is there, but I don't know how to prioritize it. I don't know how to refine it. And I don't know which emails I need to read first. And I think so, almost just taking an audit of what is that experience like if you are that parent of 4 kids in the school, and understanding what that is, I think is a good first step. I think that it leads to a point of probably understanding that however simple we think we've made it, it needs to be simpler than it is right now.
Hmm.
And this goes back to the fact that I think as schools, we probably communicate a lot of things to parents that they don't necessarily need to know or want to know. So when we complain about parents not reading things, we have to take that seriously. It could be that it's simply not of interest to them. And I know that that can be challenging to us because we feel excited about the work we're doing, and we believe in our mission, our values, our teacher profiles, and all of those things. But yet, for many parents, it goes back to that idea of what is the job that they want us to do and how do we cater to that? And I think the third thing that might be important to see is that as we think about effective communications, it's really thinking about what is it that parents need at particular points in time, and how can we develop systems and structures that allow them to get that information in a way that is in a language they understand, is simple enough, and also that we control that kind of point of entry. And that goes to the who. So we've always believed that, in a sense, there needs to be someone, I would say probably the communications director, who needs to feel like they are somehow empowered to be an orchestra conductor. And I remember once meeting many years ago someone who worked for the Labour government in the UK, and he said that, he was seen as a bit of a control freak, because he was controlling what messages went out. But he said it's a bit like giving everyone a paintbrush. If you give everyone a paintbrush, they're throwing paint on a canvas. Why would you expect that that is going to turn into a beautiful picture? And I think it's the same in schools, that sometimes we feel like everyone can have can have a paintbrush, and then we wonder why we end up with a bit of a mess. And so I think that accountability question is going back to schools to thinking, who is really controlling and are orchestrating that flow of information, particularly to parents. And that's something that, from a practical point of view, Suzette and I really worked for many years on in a school context. I think, how do we work with school leaders, principals, and other people in the school who all had great messages, but also how do we help them push those out in ways that are effective for the people that are going to read them?
I also think you have two types of parents when it comes to communications. Parents who never receive enough, and parents who always receive too much. And I think one of the things that worked for us is when we're thinking about what we're communicating is to understand, is that a push or a pull kind of piece of communication? And a lot of what we are sending out, or what we're seeing sending out to families in schools, is whatever is important is being sent out. And it is thinking about is there a place where families can go to pull information as and when required, and that we use that push format really for the things that are relevant for everyone. And that means that the person that always feels overloaded and is getting too much is really getting the bare minimum that's important, and a parent that needs more can always get more in case needed. And it's coming back to that idea of what are the jobs to be done for the different types of families that are in the school.
Does that require like being very intentional about how you set expectations for families? Right? If the expectation, maybe this wasn't the expectation that families had, but certainly maybe it's on the expectation on the school side. We're just going to blast you with as much stuff as we can, right? Versus like, no, 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 that we're going to be judicious in terms of what hits your email inbox. Instead, you've got to go here to get this stuff.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah, and making that very, very easy, very straightforward. And it's thinking about how do you set that up right from the beginning. So I think you're absolutely right by saying, how do you manage those expectations? One of the things that we did at the start of the school year when we were still working in a school is we used to send this big magazine with lots of information that we thought parents needed to know at the start of the school year. Whereas some of them have just moved country, they just came back from holidays, they forgot to buy all the materials, etc. And so when we looked at that information and we looked through the lens of, okay, what's really essential, we turned that big magazine kind of booklet into a pocket guide with 8 things every parent should know. And it had a very clear purpose that kind of set the expectations, including how, when, and why, and we were communicating with them throughout the school year. And I think that was already a first step of simplifying all the things we felt we needed to tell people right at the beginning of the school year.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I went to a restaurant recently with my son. It was kind of one of these fine dining restaurants with Heston Blumenthal in London, and we sat at the table, and the first thing that they did is set out 3 playing cards, and they said, basically, you can choose today the interaction that we're going to have with you. If you choose card A, we're going to give you no information. We're just going to serve the food and leave you on your own. If you choose card B, then we're going to give you a little bit of information about the food, the produce, and that's it. And then if you choose card C, you're all in. We're going to tell you how Heston decided to create this, why he's serving this today, the history of him, his kitchen, etc., etc. And I kind of thought, when I felt that, was, what if we did that with parents when they start with their journey with the school with us? What if we gave them the options of, how would you like us to interact with you? To Suzette's point, there are different kinds of needs. There are some parents who just want to know, contact me if my child is about to be thrown out of the school. Otherwise, and then there are other people at the other end who I want to know everything, every standard, every benchmark. I know what every module, every unit of inquiry that they're doing, and I want you to keep me up to date on a daily basis. But if we ask parents, there may be ways in the future that we can actually give them the level of communication that they need. And I think that somehow I would hope that in the future that we would be designing for parents, we get to that level of sophistication as I did in that restaurant.
All right, well, which option did you choose, David?
Oh, I was all in, of course.
Yeah, like you're not that you're there for that reason, I would imagine. Yeah, that's great. Um, if I know you do survey work, and if you were working with a school and satisfaction levels are below what they would expect, how can schools measure what matters and turn those qualitative signals into actual operational design? Like, what are some things that they should be thinking about there?
I think first of all, it's important to spend time with the data to trying to think about what's surprising, what's resonating, what questions does it raise, and use that as a starting point. And however much we think we know at that point, ask a bit more. So based on what's coming out of that, have follow-up conversations with groups of people to better understand what's happening. And I think in many ways that should give a starting point as to um, where a school should take its first steps. Because often what happens is during those conversations, it becomes very clear not just where maybe that friction is, but what they're looking for instead. And what we are noticing when we are engaging with schools, when we are doing focus groups and co-creation sessions on site, is is that they want to be part of that solution. They know very well what it is that they're looking for. And it is just listening a bit deeper, not thinking that doing the survey, having the data, and feeding back what we're learning is the job done. But how can we just listen a bit more to step away from those assumptions to better understand where they're coming from? And how can that help us guide what some of those next steps are that are literally coming from the people who've given us the feedback?
This has been great. I have one last question for you. If a head of school or leadership team wants to take the first step towards, really intentional school experience design, what's the first thing they should do?
Well, one would be I would say if you talk to one parent, one student, or one employee once a week about their experience, you would already learn a lot. Just ask them, what is your experience of school? What are some of the things that you would say are the high points of your experience? And where do you find value and where do you find that there's some friction? And I just think having that intent to ask those questions is really important. I would also say that if you're ahead of school and you're thinking about enrollment, you're thinking about what's happening when people are coming on campus, then I would do something as simple as walk outside your school gate, wherever that is, and pretend that you are a family walking in and just go through that process and think about what is it that people are experiencing for the first time? Where do they park? What is the signage that is guiding them to the right place? How are they greeted? And just follow that. And I think even understanding that sometimes we can have so many things in place, the pedagogy, the teachers, the quality, the academic results, but actually you've lost people in the car park. And actually understanding, again, it's like the hotel. The rooms are often not the problem. The problem is getting to the room. And that's where the confidence and the trust breaks down. And I think a lot of what we're thinking about is those in-between phases, that journeying to different stages is really important in helping families feel like this is a place that has thought of everything and is really value for money and for not only for us as a family, but for our children.
Oh, the key is we often tell people, put your experience glasses on because the reality is that we come in not just the head of school, but anyone in the school with the lens that we are bringing to school. So whether that is being a teacher, whether that is through the lens of HR, and we just stopped noticing things that seem very obvious. When we were working here in Brussels, we once left a dirty coffee cup on the front steps and uh, wanted to wait how long it took for someone to notice and actually take the coffee cup away. And you'll be surprised how long that took, because it's not because no one felt they could take it away. People just didn't notice it anymore. On their way into school, it was just it, it was just one of the things that was there. It took 2 weeks for that coffee cup to go
2
away.
weeks.
Which is just a very small example of how by just putting those glasses on, David gave the example of walk down to your front gate and pretend to be a family arriving for the very first time to understand what that experience is like. But even coming in today, not having the time to go to the front gate, just while you're driving up, put those experience glasses on and see and try to see what you're noticing differently that you might not have seen in some time wearing your usual glasses to school.
I love it. Great actionable advice. Perfect way to cap the pod. David, Suzette, if somebody wants to reach out, what's the best way for them to do that?
We're both on LinkedIn. You can just look up our names. Mine might be easier to spell than Suzette's. If not, hello@yellowcar.io, or our web address is yellowcar.io.
Perfect. I'll add that to the show. I'll add the URL to the show notes to make it easy for folks. Again, Suzette, David, thank you so much. As always, absolutely fantastic. And I can't wait for you to come back onto the show for a third time in the not too distant future.
Peter, it's been great. Thanks.